Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for participating in this journey that we've been on officially since October with these 3 call-in conversations about soil balancing. This is the 3rd and final call, and we'd just like to acknowledge and thank people who have been with us from the beginning, and certainly welcome the newcomers as well. My name is Matt Kleinhens, and I'm an Extension Vegetable Specialist at Ohio State University. I work from an office at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center in Worcester, which is where I am today. And my job over the next 90 minutes is to ensure that you are repaid for the time that you spend in the conversation. Repaid first with information you can use, but also in recognizing that your input is important and that we hope to hear from you going forward. Our immediate goal is to understand and to gain more completely from the philosophy and practice of soil balancing. Soil balancing, I think all of us would agree, is complex, and it seems to be a go-to set of practices for a sizable number of farmers, perhaps especially organic farmers. On the other hand, overall, the university research extension community remains skeptical of soil balancing, saying claims about it are exaggerated and recommending other approaches. That distinction alone is reason enough for us to chat. However, we may discover that in truth, we have been, and we may be continuing to ask different questions about soil balancing. And if we are asking different questions about soil balancing, we have probably been talking past each other. Regardless, I suspect that as we chat today, as we are now, and as we do going forward, it will also allow us to learn about soils, about crops, about farms and farmers and the people who advise and supply them. I think we're also stand to discover what and how various people observe and come to claim as their specific knowledge and perspectives on farm management. Our conversation should extend beyond the time we share today, so please contact me or others anytime and listen to the conversations that were recorded on October 17th and November 14th. I will soon introduce today's resource people. However, before doing that and opening the conversation, I'd like to 3 important bits of background. The first point of background is that there are 2 simple ground rules for the call. First, we have currently muted all call participants. To be heard, please unmute yourself by pressing *6 if you're using a mobile phone. Or of course the mute button on your hand on your head. Perfect. So you might have heard that. So currently you are muted and you can't be heard, but that is temporary. So to unmute yourself, press *6, and then to remute yourself, press *6 again when you're finished. The muting and unmuting process is specifically designed to prevent background noise from disrupting the conversation or intruding upon it, and to save you perhaps from an embarrassing moment, and there have been a few in other previous conversations. So not any of these, but others I've moderated. So the muting unmuting process is designed to help with that. Second, please listen carefully, but also speak up when you're invited to or when you feel the need to. Our panelists certainly will add to the conversation, but your input, whether it's a comment or a question, is essential. You can also share your input at the following web page, at the following URL, as a matter of fact. Let me be specific. It is go.osu.edu/SBNow. I'll repeat that. You can share input during the call, of course, directly using your phone, or if you prefer, using the portal at go.osu.edu/SBNow. That link is going to remain active during the discussion and after it, so please use it to share feedback about the call. So I'll ask I know that you're muted, so we'll temporarily unmute you, and I'll just ask if there are any questions about the ground rules. If there are questions about the ground rules, this would be a good time. Hearing no questions or comments, I feel like we got the ground rules in order so we can proceed. And there's a second bit of background. This call is made possible because of support from a grant from the USDA Organic Research and Extension Initiative. We want to acknowledge this support because it is very important. Perfect. So we'd also like to thank the individuals and organizations that help spread the word about the conversation and are participating in it. Our partners at OFA, at SARE, at Acres, with Farm and Dairy, and numerous other grower organizations and various individuals have been very kind to share announcements about the discussion and about the OSU-led effort to help improve people's understanding of soil balancing. And for the third and final bit of background, you may be wondering who else is on the call. We can't divulge people's individual identities, of course, but what I can tell you is that the registrant list represents 11 states, 3 countries, and various universities, businesses, and organizations. Also, most people are directly involved in sustainable organic farming in some way. As you speak up or post a comment or question, please feel free to introduce yourself, to say where you are from, and how you came to be interested in soil balancing. So unless there are questions, that completes our background. Are there any specific questions before we get to introductions and the topic of the day? We'll unmute people to allow them to do that, if there are any. Bear with me as we get through this preamble. It's going to come to an end soon, and then we'll get into the live conversation. So no questions about the background or ground rules. We can proceed with the introductions of our resource people. Today, along with you as a caller, we have 8 committed to serving as resource people. In alphabetical order they are after we mute you again. Okay, so we have Caroline Brock of Ohio State University. We have Dave Campbell of Lily Lake Farm. We have Steve Coleman of Ohio State University. Doug Dewan of Ohio State University. Matthew Krause of Bioworks Incorporated. Sabu Kumarapan of Ohio State University. Eric Pulowski of OFA. And James Schultz of Midwest BioAg. So these folks have graciously agreed to join us to offer their insights and expertise and to help fuel the conversation. They will help to address the main topic of today, which is soil balancing. The questions matter. Before we start the conversation, I'd like you to consider that soil balancing has been discussed, studied, and practiced for many years. Yet there are few aspects about which everyone would agree. Also consider that farmers, consultants, researchers, and others continue to experiment with and use soil balancing and soil balancing related approaches. It appears then that soil balancing is neither settled practice nor settled science. Next, consider that learning nearly always requires questions. Today we want to draw on what we know while focusing on important questions that remain about soils and soil balancing. There are bound to be many. So let's hear from our resource people first before turning to people on the line. And Matthew Krause, if you'll indulge me and the group and help us to start fast, I'd like to turn to you first, if that's okay, making sure that everyone's unmuted to hear him and to speak up. Matthew, you benefit from a wealth of experience with farms and soils, perhaps emphasizing soil biology. I'd like to just ask what are your current big questions? What do you want to learn next? And does what you want to learn next involve the interaction of soil biology, soil chemistry, soil physics? What are your big questions at the moment?
Well, our big questions as a company are how can we use soil microbiology, whether we influence it by the addition of specific types of soil or organic matter to the soils, or whether we're introducing specific microbes to the soils, or whether we're doing a combination of the two to build a beneficial soil microbial community that can support soil health as well as plant health and plant productivity ultimately. We're really interested in what we can do to help the grower optimize all of those systems there by not just the products that we produce, but by the information that we're connected to in the programs that we can work with the grower and helping to design. So, where our interest is in learning more about the whole concept of how cations in the soil and the cation balance, as well as anion balance for that matter, and the types of inputs growers are using in the field can be best worked so that growers can reliably get the responses that they're seeking in their plants and ultimately in their yield and quality of what they produce.
So soil microbiology and perhaps the specific introduction of certain microbes is key in that process, right?
It is. That's kind of the transition over from especially if you're talking transitional soils, from where soils have been managed conventionally for years and years and years by just putting in mineral inputs, chemical inputs, et cetera, and now trying to work those back into being more natural and more naturally productive by using the microbes that are there in the environment to do the lion's share of the cycling of nutrients and the making nutrients available to the plants, et cetera, as well as, and one of our interests is for disease control and building up the right communities. So we would look at using specific microbes that have been selected. They could be 1 in a million strains for their abilities to go in there and help resolve some of the issues that growers have with soil-borne diseases and with root diseases, damping off, et cetera, even foliar diseases, which can be influenced by the soil as well, but also control of nematodes and management of insects and other arthropod pests in those environments. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, Steve, if it's okay, I'd like to turn to you next. I mean, there's two general areas, as I understand it, and they're very broadly defined. Two general ways of learning about soil balancing, and for some of the people on the call, they may be relatively new to it. Others, of course, have a lot more experience. Those two ways are through our own experience, especially as farmers and consultants, and another way is through research, whether it's done on farms or on research stations. And then the results of that research are communicated in various articles and other reports that investigators provide. And Steve and PJ authored a review article kind of summarizing that research. And Steve, I'd like to just ask you, you heard Matthew Krause talk about his big questions around soil biology. If you could represent the review article and maybe even the broader literature, how much of that literature focuses on the soil biology aspect of balancing?
It's a pretty easy question to answer, Matt. The answer would be none of it.
Okay.
So there's been most of that work was really focused, and the measurements that they measured were the effect of base saturation, the calcium additions on base saturation, and then primarily yield. That's really been the majority of the research. Now, there's been other research looking kind of more in the weeds in terms of soil chemistry, looking at the effects of chemistry and aggregate formation and stabilization, et cetera. But it's kind of looking a little bit more holistically at all those processes and how those influence biology has yet to be done.
As I understand it, and please elaborate as you would like, I fill in the blank. I understand that some of your questions might relate to soil biology and interaction between chemistry, beginning perhaps with soil balancing like interventions or actions or practices, and the influence on biology. Am I correct, or get me back on the right track?
Sure. Well, I'll say that from all of our conversations as a team, I'm speaking collectively from Ohio State, we've talked with a lot of folks, and biology is a constant theme that keeps getting tied back to this. So on the surface, we were approaching this problem as a soil chemistry issue. How does manipulating those ratios influence chemistry? But it's clear that that there's a lot more flowing from the chemistry and the hypothesis and all of the reports that we've heard is that the chemistry is influencing the physics and it's influencing the biology, et cetera. So I'll say that we are and have been for the last number of years. We're in our fifth year of this, looking at some of the biology and trying to understand how manipulating calcium-magnesium ratios influence that. So that's, we wrapped up our I shouldn't say final, but for this project, the last field season we're going to have, and then we're in the process of looking at those data and making sense of them now.
So folks who participated in previous calls, registered for previous calls, submitted a good collection of questions to us during the calls and after the calls via that portal I mentioned, go.osu.edu/SB Now. One of those questions, I'll turn back to you again, Steve, real quick before we move to another. Before we, become very focused on soil biology, which we can return to, focus a little bit on the chemistry or the question that somebody submitted earlier, what is the role of balancing in water infiltration? This is a question that came to us some time ago, and I don't know if we have touched on it in previous calls, but maybe we need to touch on it one more time here. This person was specifically asking about the role of soil balancing in water infiltration. Is that a strictly chemistry issue? Is it a biology one too? Where do you stand on that?
Well, sure. Well, I think this really highlights, the idea that soils are composed of these kind of three core components of physical biology and chemistry, and trying to separate them out is really more of an easy way for us to think about processes and think about soil components. And in reality, they're really too connected to actually separate, right? So the working hypothesis that that we have, and certainly it's been highly informed through consultants and practitioners that use soil balancing, is that adding calcium influences and helps with the aggregation of soil, helps with soil structure, so that physical component. And from that, we've got better aggregate stability, better aeration, greater rates of infiltration. When all those things happen, you've got more oxygenated soils that are typically have the ability to hold more water, and therefore we just get greater biological activity. And in that regard, of course, that's ultimately what's better for crops, right? So that's the hypothesis. That's what we're really hoping that the things that we're looking at kind of are showing. So the idea that chemistry influences biology and physical structure at the same time.
So Dave, at Lily Lake Farm, folks, for those who don't know Dave, allow me to just mention very briefly that Dave has contributed significantly to this 4 or 5 year effort being coordinated by OSU. He's been a very informative voice in the conversation, and also, I know, a very terrific listener. And we were even chatting before the call that all of us are still learning, right? So, Dave, you wouldn't mind taking a moment to summarize your farm, perhaps much like it, I see a summary of it online anyway, but summarize what you would like to of the farm, and follow up on whatever else you have heard first from Matthew and Steve, and your own thoughts on your big questions as they pertain to the management of your soils. And Dave, you might have to push *6 if you are muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to start out with my first question. Concern would be, even though I've been doing this for I guess back since '84, the soil balancing practices, and my father had done it before that on another farm. My concern is that I am doing a fair amount of mentoring to other organic farmers, those starting up in the process. And so I want to make sure that I'm giving them some good advice and it's going to work for them. And so I'm going to start there. But as far as my farm goes, a smaller certified organic grain and operation, corn, soybeans, oats, wheat, buckwheat, many different types of cover crops. When we came onto the farm, it was pretty typical for my area. I'm located in northern Illinois, close to Wisconsin and about 50 miles west of Lake Michigan. Calcium levels were probably in that mid-50% range. Magnesium, I would say probably upper 20% range, 30% range. And so from day one on this farm, that was back in '88, I started up putting on a fair amount of high calcium lime for pHs that were 6.5 or under, and then gypsum if the pHs were 6.5 or higher, which was pretty much 6.5 to 6.8 at that time. Over the years, I've been very pleased with, especially weed control yields were probably fair, but in the last 15, 20 years, our yields have increased a fair amount. I've been using poultry manure, layer manure, which is certainly going to help with the calcium levels. And so therefore, looking at my soil test, I've noticed that I really have not put on any high calcium lime or gypsum for some time now. So things seem to be working well. I like Steve's comment about the flocculation comment I think you talked about, where the soil works a lot better now than what it did when it came here, and I shouldn't say I have no doubt, but I feel pretty strongly that the magnesium was part of the tighter soils, poor drainage and so forth. When I cultivate corn or beans, I'm noticing that the soil just seems to flow in around the bases of plants better than what it did 2-3 decades ago. And so, again, it seems to be working, but honestly, I cannot say for sure what it is that's working. I think it's a combination of a number of variables, and of course, that's the way it works a lot of times, and especially in nature, in these kind of systems and that, where a number of things seem to work together, and the results are usually pretty positive. So that's where I'm coming from. Again, it seems to work, but I cannot say that's absolutely, made all the difference. It probably hasn't. But I think fertility is a number of organic farmers, and I shouldn't say a number, but a few organic farmers tend to kind of skimp on the fertilizer, and then they wonder why their yields are poor or have a lot of weeds, and I think that's a mistake by doing that. But what we've done seems to have worked well, but still trying to improve, and also, as I mentioned before, trying to give good advice to those who are transitioning over.
Fantastic, Dave. I was wondering if I could take just a couple of minutes and follow up with you on a couple of key points that you mentioned, because they speak directly to questions that others have submitted to us, okay? Again, when they registered or at go.osu.edu/SPNow. So are you, one person asked, what is the ideal calcium-magnesium ratio, and does it differ based on soil type and CEC? Now, you've been part of a lot of conversations, and you've obviously been managing your farm. What's your take on that? Is there an ideal Ca to magnesium ratio, and is that ideal influenced by soil type and CEC?
I think there is some connection there with CECs and soil types, but I probably would not have the knowledge to actually give a good answer there.
Okay.
As far as where I'm at on my farm, right now my base saturation of calcium is in that 71 to 81% range, and so therefore the average would be somewhere probably 76, 77. Magnesium 15% to 26%, and average again probably 18 to 20 on the magnesium. So, I think it certainly has an influence, but I could not probably answer some of those questions.
Sure, James. That's fine. James, if you're willing to step in, are you for many of the people that you work with, are you shooting for a specific target in terms of calcium magnesium ratios? Apologize for going so fast. And if so, is that ratio influenced by CEC and soil type?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you well. Thanks.
Yes. I mean, years ago, of course, read Charles Walters, just edited Dr. Albrecht's works. They always talk about an 8-to-1. And the closer I get to that, the better things seem to hum. But, of course, biology is a factor. Now, he was just talking about his calcium and his magnesium saturations. I also have to look at potash, of course, to bring that up sufficiently, but that is a little influenced by what crop we're in. If we're in a forage crop that's going to move potash really fast, we just be a little cautious. If we're in a vegetable crop, we just want to push hard, we'll go a little higher. So, yes, it certainly does. As CEC climbs, it takes more to move that. So it's not that the ratio has to be different. It just change takes more product.
Okay. But
and then vice versa.
But the ratio is roughly 8-to-1, calcium and magnesium.
Yeah, and I've seen good results at less than 8-to-1, especially when biology is very active.
Okay. And both you and Dave mentioned other nutrients. And so another question that somebody else submitted to us speaks to that as well. And this person was asking, beyond that Ca to magnesium ratio, how important are other nutrients in the discussion of a balanced soil? How would you respond to that?
Well, I guess the simplest way is just to explain the way I look at a soil sample. We first look at, what are we in for a CEC, how high or how low? Is there organic matter there, to what degree? And then what are P and K levels? We got to have the bulk of the food first before we can even grow a crop, and then we look at base saturations. So, of course, it's kind of a quick glance across, and then sulfur and micronutrients, et cetera, are looked at later.
Okay, so would you be using or perhaps recommending fertilizer additions beyond the soil balancing kind of concept or philosophy? In other words, soil balancing and a SLAN or build-up maintenance like approach is kind of blended into the recommendation, or how does that
exactly
work?
Yeah,
Okay.
basically blending. If nutrient levels, say P and K, are 2/3 of sufficient range or less than that, then we need to build them. But I don't ignore magnesium or calcium either. It's just all budget dependent. It's a case by case.
Sure. So there might actually be a time when you would apply magnesium, for example.
Certainly. Yeah, 5 pounds an acre has always been a good. It just depends on the crop.
I mean, listening to, unless I'm admitting this, okay? So I don't want to transfer this to anybody else, but I have at times stopped and made myself pause to say, magnesium is not evil. Magnesium
right.
is not wrong. So, am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I would say everything, it's all about either solubility of the nutrient or what's tied into the biological carbon cycle. So there's a twofold balance there. Is it soluble and easily accessible chemically, or is it tied in biology? And when we get, say, the scenario of a high magnesium and a moderate to low calcium, well, we need to tip that seesaw, for lack of better explanation.
Sure.
And make things more available. Usually when a high magnesium is there, it's not very available, there's not a lot of life, etc.
So Eric, if I could draw you out next. I mean, Dave mentioned wanting to be a good mentor and obviously being very active in a mentorship role, mentorship capacity. A very experienced and successful farmer assisting others in becoming the same. And certainly, Eric, you wear different hats, and one of the hats that I understand you wear at OFA is to listen to growers, listen to the members, discuss issues that they're facing and questions that they have that OFA and or one of its partners or people that they collaborate with could help them address. What are you hearing What have you heard and what are you hearing regarding soils and their management, and maybe even specifically the soil balancing? Anything that stands out? And again,
hey, thanks, Matt. You mentioned earlier Acres USA helped promote some of these speech, and we were down there just last week. So some of the conversation that I was hearing around there, because spurred by the dynamics of the speakers, is again, we got kind of a dichotomy here. Is it the soil that's feeding the plant, a la Dr. Elaine Ingram, or is it the plant feeding the soil, a la John Kemp? So those were a lot of the type of soil balancing questions that we were discussing over the weekend. But here in my work with OFA in the last few seasons, as I look at soil balancing concepts, one of the things that was embedded in Albrecht's work was that these ratios are tied to the pH, and so we can dial that stuff down pretty specifically there, but it's also tied to the amount of rainfall that you get in your area. So leaching of these in the soil, especially with these dramatic rain events that we've been witnessing these last few years, that's really where my questions have been is, I'm looking at my soil tests, I'm trying to mineralize through off-farm inputs, or I'm trying to maximize my biology from a variety of ways of cover cropping or composting, or, again, bugs in a jug. So, those are where we are. I don't know if there's good answers, but, as a community, that's why we're having these calls, and I, again, appreciate you taking the leadership on bringing these communities together. That's where I am, especially in a high tunnel. A lot of the farmers that I work with are specialty crop growers, and as we're trying to do this stuff and seeing the salts develop in high tunnels, and I see all that tie into the leaching concerns that I have with the expense of bringing these inputs onto the farm and how long they're going to hang out, especially when we have these dramatic rain events that we can't necessarily predict.
Excellent comment. There's probably very few things as central to the success of the planet. The health of the planet is the health of our soils, right? And especially the health of our agricultural soils. And soil health, although very difficult to pin down in terms of how to measure it and assess it and communicate it even, is still very much a focus of the efforts of many people on this call, and of course others that they know. So as a practice, whatever practice, whether it's soil balancing or using compost or what have you, rotation and all the like, soil health is right in front of us, right? Dave, if you farming the same, if you will, farming the soils as you have and seeing them change over time, do you have big questions that remain regarding how you assess the health of your soil?
That's a great question, Matt. Obviously, things are getting better every year. I think the cover crop component has really helped with that. It's just a process that it just takes so long, and it's probably a little change that it's really hard to tell from year to year. And then, as Eric had mentioned too, with the rain events we're having, some massive amounts of rain in short amounts of time, that factors into it. So I can tell you that it's certainly much better now than it was back when we came here in '88. But there again, so many things have changed, especially the rotation, the cover crops, the crops I'm raising, and so forth, has entered into it. And one thing I did not mention before, we talked about weeds. Yes, the weeds have gotten much, much better, except for one weed, it's a perennial weed, it's Canada Thistle. And that one it's a real challenge. And I did go through here maybe 10 years ago, and I soil tested my farm, and then I came back the same day and soil tested one field that had some patches of thistles, the patches only, and when I took the soil test results, it came back virtually the same numbers, even down to the trace. Not exactly, but very statistically not significant when it comes to even the trace minerals too. So that kind of made me think a little bit. I don't have a good answer for that, but I just think it involves a lot of different management practices.
So I want to be correct here, Dave. Would you, and perhaps Doug Doohan should lead this conversation right here, right now, because he's far more qualified to do that than I am with regard to the weed aspect. But before we turn to Doug directly, let me just ask you if you feel that your approach, which has included soil balancing, has contributed to your relative success with weed control or in weed management.
Yes, I believe it has, especially in those first few years, 5, 10, 15 years, I think it has. But again, can't prove it, but I think it has. Yeah.
We can believe things without having the firm, hard evidence, right? We have to use other ways. And so part of the conversation here is about respecting all the ways that we learn and drawing from them, right? And so the researchers around the table are probably going to trust their data. Maybe this is a good time to turn to Doug Doohan. We will trust our data, if you will. We'll put an emphasis on our data, but I think we're well aware that they alone may not tell the story. But Doug, if you may, what are your big questions, I guess, or the things that perplex you most or excite you most about the balancing weed or some other question? I don't want to bound it by weeds only, but maybe to start with weeds. But if there are others, please elaborate.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And as I speak, I'm thinking about the survey results that Doug Jackson-Smith and Caroline Brock have shared with some of us that show that for the typical person who would fall into a category, typical farmer who would fall into the category of soil balancer, that a characteristic of those individuals seems to be that not only do they use more limestone and more gypsum, they use more of everything. And so as yields go up, as productivity increases, as soil quality, soil biology is on the upswing, we can attribute that to soil balancing, or we can say what really is causing this. Is it all of these things together? And so I think really an outstanding question that we are maybe seeing some indications from the field research, from the experiment station research trials in particular, that have allowed us to sort of segregate out effects that may be related directly to improving the so-called balance of the soil. But clearly, that's something that we're going to need to continue to parse out. And I think that Dave's comments also kind of alluded to that. He was doing a lot of things. Soil quality has been getting better. We do know that we have seen some effects that we think can be attributed to calcium levels, though. And in our trials, we have seen what appear to be statistically significant effects on grass weeds in particular. I think that one of the challenges that we're going to continue to deal with is sort of separating fact from fancy in this, because I have had soil balance farmers tell me that the reason that the Canada thistle there is because there's not enough calcium, and when you get the and it's there to pull up calcium from lower levels in the soil than in the plow layer. And once you get the calcium where it needs to be, the thistle goes away, which is kind of counter to what Dave has observed. So I think that this is why this research is so important, and for people like Dave who are mentoring young farmers. Dave, you never said this, but I wondered if part of what you were thinking about when you alluded to your mentorship is that you'd like to have a higher degree of confidence in terms of the suggestions that you give to those farmers as to what it's going to, what the outcome will be from those various sorts of management practices, inputs that you might be suggesting. And again, I think we would all agree that we need that, and that as we go forward looking more closely at soil balancing, that we can parse some of those things out so that Dave and others like Dave will be in a better position to do just that.
Yeah, folks, I'd like to hit the pause button real quick. Looking across our resource people, two of whom we have not heard from yet, Caroline and Sabu, and we will hear from them soon. You have, if you are keeping notes of sorts, you have in those 8 people individuals who have spoken with, interacted with many farmers over the years. So it's my understanding that they are channeling not only their own individual, of course, thought process and curiosity around balancing, but perhaps also that is influenced by input that they've been given from other people. Eric with OFA, and Dave and his mentorship, and Doug and Matthew and James and Eric interacting with all the growers that they have, and you'll hear from Sabu and Caroline here soon, who've interacted with a lot of growers too, although somewhat in some cases indirectly, but still hearing from a lot of growers. So it's particularly exciting today to have this group of resource people who can draw on the input that they have and have received from many other growers. Let me just ask at this point, before we hear from Caroline and Sabu, if there are any questions from people who have called in. We should pause and ask them. Some may say I should give you an assignment to come up with a question. But anybody wanting to follow up on a point that hasn't been addressed yet? Okay, fair enough. Caroline, if we could, if you wouldn't mind contributing next. Caroline, I'll just give a bit of a preamble. Caroline and Doug Jackson-Smith have been able to, through in-depth interviews and other means, synthesize quite a range of input from farmers who employ balancing and balancing-like approaches at different levels of intensity and in different ways. And Caroline, as you've been listening to all this conversation, looking at the input that you did receive from all those people, what are your big, still unanswered questions or biggest sources of points about which you are most curious when it comes to soil balancing and understanding it as a philosophy or practice? Does anything stand out to you from your own perspective on what's most exciting to consider?
Well, I guess I'll just start off with a few main findings, and one being from the 24 interviews that we did with farmers is that soil balancing, which we spoke to a bit in previous calls, the practice of it is more complex and integrated, right, than just balancing those key cations, as we were talking about today, that biology and other components are really important. And then another key finding that kind of comes out of our work is that previous studies haven't really tested the complexity that the farmers are actually practicing out there, which we were also alluding to today in the call. One of the findings that we found from doing a survey, which we had about 860 respondents from 4 different states, is that not only are soil balancers using more of high calcium amendments, as Doug just mentioned, they're also using a variety of other inputs, more than other self-described soil balancers. And so it's kind of reflective of what Dave Campbell said, that maybe there's some organic farmers out there skimping on fertilizers, but the self-described soil balancers actually put on more of other things too. So that leads to some puzzles. So Suba's going to tell us a little bit more about findings that we have from the survey in terms of yield data and other economic data, but it can be difficult to kind of interpret that data because not only are they using more high calcium amendments, but they're also using more of a variety of other kinds of fertilizers too. So how do we parse out the effect of the high calcium amendment, and do we want to do that? How do we want to do that? And then that leads to another big question, is how do we at the university better test soil balancing so that it's reflective, more reflective and relevant for the farmers and the practices that they're doing that go well beyond balancing cations. So some of the questions that would love people in the call to actually contribute to is maybe what additional practices are really important to you that you see are a part of soil balancing. That could be, a number of different things. I think that would help us as researchers kind of figure out what fits into that picture of soil balancing for folks. And also help us think about how we might balance and how we might actually design on-farm studies and experimental design studies that would be more reflective of the complexity of the farmer practices.
Caroline, that's excellent. There's a bunch of good stuff in there, and I'd say that one question, the one question specifically about the universities, is echoed by another caller, okay, and what they submitted when they registered. And if it's okay, I'm going to call on Dave and Matthew Krause, whom we haven't heard from in a little while, but we will hear from next, and Eric and James, okay? Notice all the non-university people, okay? We have 8 resource people today, and we have a good collection of non-university people, which is really exciting. So the question that was submitted by another registrant is this. I would hope that 4 of you could help address. Why has soil balancing not been accepted by universities? Why has it not been more widely accepted by universities? The university people are not allowed to comment on this, okay? Okay? Strictly for the 4 of you, Dave, Matthew, Eric, and James. And anyone could start. And don't worry about what you're saying, obviously. We're among friends and family here at some level, okay? So what is your take on that? Why hasn't soil balancing been more widely accepted by universities?
Well, I'll jump in first, I guess. I really appreciated the research that VJ did in doing the literature review of what they've actually studied. And trying to replicate the dynamics of what is happening out in the field in 8-inch pots in a greenhouse, I don't think is an apples-to-apples comparison. So when you're trying to, again, this is our Newtonian science. We're going to break things down into components, and we're going to study one component. But when you're actually looking at the dynamics of life, that's out there interactive on the field, under the sun, in a great, cosmos of activity. So when you try to break it into components and only study certain deconstruction aspects of it, I don't think you're going to be able to replicate it accurately. And when you try to do it in that way and the results come out negative, then you're going to believe that. At least that's how I interpret it.
Okay, now James and Dave and Matthew, I'm breaking the silence of the university people just as the moderator. Eric, let me come back to you real quick before hearing from the other 3. You referenced the distinction between a rural reductionist approach using the pots to kind of project what would happen in the field. And what was found when that was done was not necessarily what others have experienced in managing their farms. Is that the point that you're making? That we have been unable to replicate the results of other people with our way, therefore we haven't accepted it? I'm speaking, obviously, in very broad terms. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think you grabbed the gist of it.
Okay. Matthew, James, David,
Yeah, to add to that, this is Matthew Krause. To add to that, I think it's perplexing to many university researchers because where do you start? Because you have to start from some place to do proof of concept, to say, okay, we're onto something here now. Let's build onto this to see how we can relate it to this factor and substantiate what the grower is seeing here, et cetera. But I also think that in trying to understand something as complex as this and all of the interactions, not just the chemical and the physical, but when you really bring in the soil biology, not just the fungi and bacteria, but also the nematodes and the microarthropods, et cetera, we may be not measuring the right parameters either. And ultimately, what the grower is most interested in, to keep his or her operation running, is the profitability of that. And what is that profitability based on? It's based on yield. It's based on quality of what they're producing. And I still think we need to go back to that, go back to the plant as the ultimate indicator of the soil health, because it depends upon that soil. And if there are parameters that still have yet to be discovered, or if there are new tools that are being developed where we can go in and monitor many of these inputs at one time and different permutations of them, I think that will make it a lot easier for university and federal research folks to be able to really identify what are the major contributing factors and how they interact with one another.
So Matthew, if I could paraphrase, tell me if I have it correct. It hasn't been accepted by universities because A, it's very complex. We don't deal with complexity very well, especially when we use the approach that Eric outlined, which is to break everything down into its pieces, parts.
I wouldn't say that. It's just trying to decide where to start.
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, you don't eat an elephant in one bite, right?
Right.
It takes multiple. But what are the group of factors you want to start with first?
So where would you start before we hear from James and from Dave on the same question? But where would you start, just broadly speaking? I'll put you on the spot there. Where would you start?
I don't know. I'm just as baffled as you are. I guess I would start. I would look at what's living in that soil, the plants, the crop, the weed species, and then I would look at not specific, species of bacteria and fungi particularly, but really look at the functional groups of those there, because they can report to you what's going on in that soil, and to also look at not just total organic matter in the soil, but what types of organic matter are there. There's a lot of information out there that was developed over several years using wet chemistry and whatever, even going back into the turn of the 20th century, that it's a lot of research that maybe has been lost, but we should go back to and look at before we even have widespread use of mineral fertilizers. And maybe that can be more modernized and linked to what we're talking about here with soil balancing. So maybe we've already done a lot of research in this area, but it's just been so fragmented and nobody's ever really assembled it. So maybe we need to go back and look at those things too. So I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think well. I mean, I don't think there is, quote, the answer, but your answer, I think, is very, very good. At least it makes a lot of sense to me. I heard 2 points in it before we turn to James and Dave. One, begin with what's living. The soil, the microbes in the soil, the crops and the weeds as potential indicators of the health of the soil, perhaps as changed by soil balancing. That's the first thing I heard. And the second thing I heard is that, hey, be mindful of what's already been done research-wise and don't repeat the wheel and do a better job of drawing on it.
Right.
2 take-homes that I heard. But Dave or James, to the big question of why soil balancing is not more widely accepted by universities, anything that you would like to add to that question so far?
Yeah.
Go ahead, James. Go ahead.
The crops, particularly what? So I see as a consultant response, especially in high value or seed crops, but legumes as well. Legumes, especially talking to calcium, just the way they work with nodulation. I don't think there's been enough research on them specifically regarding soil balancing. I can't say I'm one that has researched dug into the research incredibly well, but I have not noticed much on that.
James, your sense of the research is that it hasn't been done on the right crops, or to the extent it's needed on the right crops. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Of course, it's a system, so it can't be continuous soybeans or et cetera, but they need to be highlighted a little more than corn always gets highlighted as king, so to speak.
Sure. So the previous research may not have been may not have used the right crop, so to speak.
Yeah, I know there was cases back in Albrecht where they were using some of that, but a lot of that was pot research as well in the greenhouse. Okay.
And Dave, I know that you'll have something important to say here. What's your take on why universities haven't accepted soil balancing more widely?
Well, first of all, I think all the comments made were spot on. So I agree with everything that's been said. I think, especially with the reductionist approach, I mean, that's where our minds tend to go there first. Let's, try this variable, and we'll see a difference. Hopefully, it'll be a short-term thing, and so we can look at that. But the way our soils work and living systems, that is obviously a long-term sort of approach. Another thing I just heard about very recently was the key to success, and I'm sure this was not organic grain farms. It was farms in general, conventional farms, was not so much how much fertilizer, equipment, or those types of things. It was the level of organic matter in the soils. And that spoke volumes to me as to overall health and where we need to go with this, cover crops and so forth. So that spoke pretty loud. I think also, let's face it, when things started changing pretty drastically in the late 70s, 80s, and that, we have lack of good policy from USDA. And so the tail kind of wags the dog, so to speak. And let's face it, a lot of companies are not going to make money off of calcium, gypsum, or high-cal lime, those kind of products. And so when the whole paradigm started shifting back in the late 60s and 70s, livestock left the farms, then we got into a different type of system, corn and beans, more monoculture, and that kind of changed what we had going for us. And that's going to work for a number of years because we had all that there from the beginning. And so now we're finding ourselves getting into more problems than that with weeds and whatever else.
And would it be fair to say, Dave, that, obviously painting with an extremely wide brush here, but just to maybe drive home the essence or the gist of what you mentioned, would it be fair to say that as that paradigm shifted and systems changed, that the university focused on those systems? They kind of left some of the soil balancing related and other types of systems behind. Is that fair, is that accurate in your mind?
Well, that is accurate, and I think it's just, if you've got money, you've got power, and you can influence people. But even beyond that, just the way we were testing things with more of a reductionist approach, and that has just lent itself more to what's been happening in the last few decades. And now we're starting to realize that we need to look beyond that type of approach.
Fair enough.
Matt,
yeah, please.
At some point, I know we need to hear from Subu, but I have a couple of questions, one for Matt Krause and one for Dave Campbell.
Please, jump in.
Sure. This is a good time.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with Dave first. And Dave, I want to throw a thought out at you and hear your response to it. And this idea is triggered to some degree by what you had said earlier about the way the soil flows over the tines, the cultivator tines, or over the harrow tines. It flows. I took that to mean that it's more fluid, it's more less clumpy.
Yeah, and, better population. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would hold out, and again, I want to hear from you that a balanced by achieving a balanced soil. By that means alone, a farmer is never going to rid him or herself of weeds and weed problems. However, with a balanced soil, one might find that the weed control practices that they do use, the tillage, the cultivation, the use of timely planting, stale seed beds, etc., they all are potentially going to be more successful. And the final outcome in terms of weed growth versus crop growth is again got to be more successful in a balanced soil. And I think I want to hear from you, but I think that could be important because sometimes it seems that for some farmers, the key to weed control is actually to get a balanced soil.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Doug. I think that sometimes farmers tend to look for that magic bullet, and some may say, okay, it's all about calcium, all about balancing soils, or someone else may say, well, no, I need to put on more chicken manure, whatever it may be. And I think it's just a system that's very, maybe somewhat complex, but it's just a combination of many things. And, of course, that's hard to flesh that one out as far as what are you going to attribute success to, all those variables. But I think and maybe it should be that way. It's just the way it is, I'll say. But I did notice one point I did not bring up earlier was that with the Canada Thistle issue was when I've got a couple of fields where I've got mostly some tighter soils, Holton and Batavia muck kind of soils. And as soon as my equipment, field cultivators, row crop cultivators, as soon as I hit that spot, I've got some thistles, and I've just pulled harder. And so, therefore, there are some things that, even though the field's been treated the same, although I probably should maybe put on more calcium in those areas, but I think that we're working, too, with structures, soil types, especially that we just cannot really change. Maybe we can improve somewhat, but some of those things are just hard to change.
Okay, thanks, David. Is it okay if I go
Yeah.
ahead and talk to Matt?
Yeah.
So, Matt, one of the things that I have heard farmers say in talking about soil biology is they'll say something like this, build the house and the microbes will come. They will live in it. And what that means to them, at least to some degree with some of them, is that soil balancing is part of the process of building the house, along with the other practices that that bring organic matter additions to the soil. Now, I'd like you to comment on that, and I'd also like you to comment a little bit on the whole notion of functional groups. And I think you were probably restricting your comments mostly to soil microorganisms of sorts, but what about different weeds as serving functional roles in the agroecosystem, and might those too tell us something about the soil, in your opinion?
Well, for your first question, yeah. So I came out of the Hoytink lab there at Ohio State, and we were focused on biological control of plant diseases, and then looking at natural disease control taking place in normal soils, as well as coming up with strains isolated from those environments that were suppressive, so that we could bring them into systems where they were more sterile, like potting mixes or soils that have been just continually beaten year after year after year with standard tillage, and to where the organic matter pretty much disappeared. But that expression, we use that expression, build it and they will come, just like Field of Dreams, right? The movie from several years ago with Kevin Costner. But that's exactly right. If you build the right environment there and you're putting in not just organic matter, that's kind of a mistake, because we have a lot of people that now are they're new at this and they're trying to increase soil microbial activity, and they may be doing it, but they may be doing it in the wrong way. There are proponents out there of some consultants that talk about adding molasses, for instance, to the soil, because that's going to improve microbial activity. and they measure that by CO2 release or what have you. And yes, in fact, it does certainly bring the soil microbe levels higher, but not necessarily the right ones. What we don't want to do is promote the pathogens in the soil, like Pythium and Phytophthora and Rhizoctonia and Fusarium. What we want to do is promote the beneficials in the soil, the beneficial bacilli, the beneficial trichodermas that may not be responsible for disease control, but they are the ones that are cycling the nutrients. Those are the ones that are forming the wet, stable aggregates of particulate organic matter in the soil, which is where a lot of that nutrient cycling takes place. And so it's looking at the right organic matter for that soil, which needs to be stabilized if you're going to be bringing it in from outside, or if these are crop residues that are breaking down, it's from those crops. And it's not anything extraneous. We're going to be introducing anything that could be detrimental to the plant or detrimental to the soil. So, yes, in fact, that's why we need to be looking at soils over long term rather than just over season to season, or just within a single season, or just within the actual cropping time. We should be looking before the crop is planted, after the crop is harvested, and everywhere in between, because we can influence that environment quite easily just by having the right organic matter in the soil, not overloading it, not making it deficient, and then, of course, balancing what kind of nutrition and cations and anions we're introducing into that soil. So hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, thank you.
As to the weeds, some of those weeds that are not invasive, they're part of our ecosystem, right? So they're still community members when it comes to other plants. Yeah, we could be using them as indicators as well. Just like if you look at water quality in streams, you have good insect species and so forth that you can detect in a healthy stream, mollusks as well, and then you have those that are associated with polluted streams and waterways, and they're great indicators as well. I think we could probably apply the same logic to weed species, or at least to non-crop plants that are found in those soils. Because maybe, in horticultural soils, you have plants you wouldn't really consider weeds that are robbing the target crop of nutrients, but they may be just simply holding soil in place as understory plants. And maybe those could also be used as tools to measure the quality of the soil.
So Matthew, before we turn to Sabu, I'd like to ask that you address maybe one more question for the moment. Sure. Two people who participated in previous calls sent in the following two questions, one of which I believe has been answered, but it's a segue to the second. The first question was, what benefits do we expect to receive from soil balancing? In my humble opinion, I think across the three calls and plus much of the literature on soil balancing, particular literature that's available in the kind of extension and lay literature, Albrecht's books and the like, I think though that question has been answered perhaps partly. But the second question that somebody asked, I don't recall being addressed directly that you might be able to help us with. This person asked if there's any evidence to support the idea that soil-dwelling insects, that was their particular interest. But I'll put the question to you from a disease management standpoint, plant disease management standpoint. Is there any reason to suspect that altering the soil chemistry in ways that soil balancing can would influence the frequency and or intensity of plant disease? Now, I know that's a big question, but answer it bigly, if you will, like yes or no, it's reasonable. Or yes,
absolutely. And, I'll go back to a pot system. that can help us with that. So if you look at, and I'll use an example of rhododendron that's produced by nurseries. We know that if they're using, if a grower is really pushing rhododendron and they want 3 flushes of growth for a season, and we'll use Northeast Ohio up in Lake County as an example. Growers there for years have practiced, just putting either spoon-feeding nutrition on them with a constant liquid feed of a water-soluble fertilizer package, or they'll use controlled-release fertilizers in there, chemical controlled-release fertilizers, etc. But and they'll be basing their nutrition plan on the needs of the plant to push it along and to get those 3 flushes of growth. But they're also losing a lot of nutrition as well because most of those nutrients are soluble and they're leaching out. So it's literally a shotgun approach. If you think about it, it's more like a shotgun approach at plant nutrition. Most of that nutrition is not being held by that soil. It's leaching out. So what's happened is those salts build up either in that soil environment, because you'll have some salts that remain behind, or they'll end up in the surface water, which they'll recycle as irrigation water. And in so doing, they're doing 2 things. One, they're increasing the salinity of that soil, or that growing matrix for those roots, which makes the plant, stresses the plant itself, and the plant actually doesn't know it, but it's actually signaling to the pathogens around those roots that it's under stress. Pythium and Phytophthora, which are water molds, they're not true fungi. They're closer to algae in their biology and in their genetics, but they respond to the plant signaling that it's in distress, and at the same time they're able to flourish with the higher phosphorus, the higher nitrogen, etc. And add to that higher salinity also enhances the production of their reproductive apparatuses that produce zoospores that then can swim towards those root systems, etc. So there's an example where, yes, in fact, what you're doing with one type of nutrition and one type of practice that tends to be what we consider more conventional, more mineral, more chemical, is having on the crop when it comes to disease. It's stressing the plant, and it's promoting the pathogen growth, development, and activity. If you're going out into a field soil and you're putting in the right organic matter there, and you're getting the colonization of the beneficial microbes in the soil, and a lot of people think about mycorrhizae and everything, that they're only one part of the picture if they are mycorrhizal plants. But you have other microbes that are there that are cycling nutrients, but they're also supporting the naturally occurring strains and those that you might bring in that could also prevent disease out there. But the point being, if you're really managing that soil well, and I think if you're using the soil balancing approach and you're bringing in a variety of different amendments into that soil that each have good characteristics, which you all relate it back to the soil organic matter component and the quality of that organic matter, then the plant is going to be less stressed, is going to be more resilient, and better able to defend itself against those pathogens when they do come into play. But you'll also have the microbial diversity in those soils to prevent the buildup of several of those pathogens that I just mentioned.
Right. So moving real quick, just to recap what I understand you to have said is that soil chemistry does affect soil biology, and one aspect of the biology is the potential pathogen community, and the connections, while not well studied within the balancing context, are still there within the plant pathology literature, for sure.
Yep.
So, and we've never, to my knowledge, we don't think of soil balancing in an IPM context. We to my knowledge, we haven't discussed integrated pest management in these 3 conference calls, nor do we often hear of soil balancing being referred to as an IPM strategy. I don't know if we should. That's an open question. But if it's affecting soil biology, at least the weed population and maybe the microbial population, pro and con, and water infiltration and creating or not a conducive environment for disease or other stress, it is very much an integrated crop management or integrated pest management strategy.
No, I think that's super important that you talk about it in that context, because unfortunately, most of the research that's done when on new cropping systems or new greenhouse production, et cetera, they frequently leave out the plant pathologists and the entomologists from the research. And then when something goes wrong, then they call us in to figure out what the problem is. And if the pathologists, the entomologists, nematologists are involved in that research from the get-go, the grower ends up benefiting greatest, because we don't have to try to think about the other issues that might develop because of this practice or of that practice.
That's something we have to discuss over a pint. I would say
absolutely.
we definitely need to hear from Sabu. But I'll close that part of the conversation anyway. Obviously, we're on the phone. We can't see each other. There's none of that nonverbal going on. But I am grinning, and I am saying that the horticulturists are often left out, and then when things go wrong, they're drawn in to help explain the reactions. Anyway, all in good.
You guys just have to talk more. That's the deal.
All in good fun. So this conversation today has been constructed around the question, what are our questions, right? What are our big questions? What remains unknown about soil balancing, or said another way, asked another way, what are we most curious about? What are we perplexed by? What are we excited by? What do we want to set our sights on next? That has been the context for this conversation, and we haven't heard from somebody who's very important in that conversation yet, but we're about to in Sabu, because Sabu has, and others, have taken great pains to, with the cooperation of growers, collect a large amount of information, data. Our previous call, number 2, was about the numbers, so bouncing by the numbers. And if there's one thing that Sabu has in quantity, it is numbers, okay? And Sabu has had some time, not a lot, but some time to go through those numbers. And so, Sabu, I'll turn to you next and just ask, what are you most curious about, excited about, perplexed by, if you will? What do you want to know next based on the numbers you have at your disposal?
Thanks, Matt. Economics is at the front and center, even though we are discussing it at the end of the conversation. That's okay. Hey, you have to humor people, okay, so that people will pay attention to you. Actually, as I was going through the survey results and trying to analyze the numbers, these are dollar figures, I came up with, say, 3 major questions. And, that is what I was trying to post in a nice manner so that everybody can understand, especially this being a telephone call. So this survey focused mostly on organic corn. Now, they are producing organic corn, and we collected information on both grains and silage. And there was a positive yield effect and revenue effect when it comes to grains, but not with regard to silage. So that is question number 1. So calcium does have some positive effects, and it shows up on certain aspects of crops, but not in all the crops. We already talked about legumes and vegetables. So what are we going to do about those type of other crops? Will there be a positive effect on those crops as well? That is question number 1. I'm sure other people have analyzed that, and even in this project, we have had different types of vegetable crops and other things that we discussed throughout. Any inputs on that before I move on to my second question?
Could you argue? Could one argue that because silage is used on the farm and the grain is sold, that there's some, it's almost psychological, that the farmer might put a little bit more intensity into that grain crop that's going to have cash coming directly back from the grain as opposed to going through the cows.
That's a good point. I mean, we are measuring the yield, and these are self-reported yields, right? So when you look at the yield for grain, for the grains, it's about they're reporting on an average, okay? I mean, this may not really happen in a particular farm situation. And the calcium users, they report about 143 bushels per acre, let's say, on an average. Whereas the non-calcium users, they don't report the same number. They are reporting a little less. Now, when we are looking at the similar set of numbers for silage, we don't see that difference. So, that is some question that we need to analyze more. So let's move on to the second question. And this is where I am really interested in because it's all about dollar figures. And in economics, we use something called marginal cost, marginal benefit. Marginal cost is how much more are they spending, and marginal benefit is how much more they are receiving for their efforts. So when you look at these numbers, again, these are averages. The calcium users, they report that they are spending about $60 more when it comes to their farming operations. This includes machinery, it includes fertilizers, it includes seed and the land quality. And there are a few things that we did not collect information on in the survey. And when you look at their benefits, that is the yield times price that they are receiving, they are getting $150 more, the organic corn grain farmers. So there is a positive effect, that you are seeing in terms of yield that also translates into dollar figures. So which is a good sign, and this is what many people have been talking about here. But my question is, self-reported numbers and yield. This being a risk, university-wide research question, and you asked why universities are not taking it up. If universities were to take it up, will these self-reported numbers and yields show up in those accurate? And, that is a tough question, and it needs a lot more hands and, brains and eyeballs to look into that. That is a question. So self-reported numbers, or do they stand valid even within university research? Maybe that is something that you may want to look forward to then in the next step. So that is with regard to that. So the second question is, there is a marginal benefit for using calcium. How does it translate into, say, university-wide measurements or like an accurate scientific measurements? That's what I should say.
Could you pause real quick? I know we're coming close to the end, but clarify for the people listening approximately how many growers you heard from in this survey and what footprint, geographic area that they represent.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to talk about that, but it was the end of the conversation, so I did not get into that. So the survey was conducted in the months of February, March, and April 2018. And we sent out this survey to all the organic corn farmers. They've numbered about 1,680 plus in the states of Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Okay. And we got a 60% return rate, which is really good. We were surprised too. We were getting mails after mails. So it took a significant part of our time over the months of May, June, July to enter the data, summarize, and start analyzing it. So that is where we are at right now, and I'm sure Carolyn and Doug Jackson-Smith will be meeting over this in the coming days and weeks to discuss more about these type of things.
So for people to appreciate your first two questions and the third that you're going to get to here, it would be well for them to keep in mind what you just said about the survey. 1,000 plus growers reached, 60%, 600 plus, 800 plus actually returning information, sharing information, and so your questions are drawn from looking at the numbers from 800 farmers. That's an important item to establish. So yeah, anything more to say about the second question, or
let's move on to the third question in the interest of time. The presence of calcium matters. That's what I am seeing when I look at it from the dollar figures. But among the calcium users, the amount of money that they spend on toward calcium and how it relates to the yield, that doesn't matter. So a farmer who is spending only $20, $30 per acre, the amount of benefits that they are receiving is more or less comparable with somebody who is spending $70 or $80 or $100 per acre. That is the type of signals that I'm getting from the data right now. So the question is, what about the amount of calcium that they are using, or the type of calcium? There are different types of calcium. In fact, Carolyn and I were discussing this a little earlier. Gypsum, lime, high-cal lime, and dolomite. Do they make a difference? Whether any particular farmer that uses dolomite report much higher yield than the other calcium users. And these are some questions that we will be looking at in the coming days. And also another interesting question that we will be able to answer based on this survey result is the intensity or the duration of calcium application. They used it in 2017. Did they use it in 2016, 15, and 14? How much did they use, the collective value? As of now, I can only guess, but I don't want to make guesses in a phone call. It's just a really bad idea. Right. But these are the type of questions that I have that I will be looking at, and I'm sure others can give their opinion and feedback, and I look forward to hearing any of those things as well.
So we do have 2 or 3 minutes, and this is and Sabu was kind of joking about the economics coming last. Well, in fact, I mean, I would argue that it's appropriate to, in the sense that we've covered a lot of territory, and not only this call, but the previous 2, weeds and water and chemistry and biology and all of the topics. In the final analysis, and I certainly don't need to tell this to anybody who's on this call and one's listening, that decisions have financial consequences, right? They have economic consequences. And they may have environmental ones as well, but certainly they have economic ones. So before we leave this entirely and wrap up this conversation and let people get on to other things, James, Dave, you heard what Sabu had to say. Do you have anything that you would like to ask him in follow-up about the economic side of things, as you also have interacted, and maybe Eric as well, interacted with the farmers that you have and their general level of satisfaction with what's happening?
Well, this is Dave. I mean, one brief thing that comes to my mind is some of the farmers who are transitioning over and employing this practice of soil balancing, maybe putting on larger amounts of calcium versus someone who's been at it for a while. So, there's so many variables it would be hard to flush out, but that's one thing that comes to my mind.
Fair enough. It's like the longevity of engagement with balancing, and its possible effect. James or anybody else that would like to put a question to Sabu about the economics. It was a story concisely delivered, but I think highly impactful. Anything that you would like to add or comment on or ask Sabu about, given your interaction with the growers that you have? Maybe still profit.
Have you seen a difference in ROI or profit back to the farm when the soil balancing model is used in an overarching umbrella?
There is a positive result. There is some returns that we can assign that it is happening because of calcium application. Now, whether those particular farms were actually balanced, what is the ratio of calcium, magnesium, which has been the primary driver for this research, that question I don't have information to answer that. In fact, I mentioned this to Steve just a few days ago, whether we can collect some additional information about the quality of soil, based on their lab research work, and attach that data to this survey data to see if there can be any kind of correlations that we can find, that this is the type of BCSR ratio they have in this field, and this is the type of dollar returns that they are reporting in that. So that is an area that we can explore in the future, I guess.
That may be an excellent place to stop, if I heard you correctly, Sabu and James. James, you were asking if there was a positive ROI for those that had applied calcium. And Sabu's response, I believe, was yes, applied calcium. But we still don't know if those farms were balanced.
Yeah.
Okay? So the bigger question might be, are balanced farms more profitable?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Level, right? is there a positive ROI for balancing? And I know that that's a question that probably at least 7 of the 8 resource people would like to chime in on, but we might have to wait for the next discussion. But maybe that's a good place to leave it. Are balanced farms more profitable? Are they receiving a positive ROI? Ironic at some level that we wait to the final minute to get to that particular question, but it's a really, really good one. So,
and just one note on that, Matt. Personally, as a consultant, I would like it to not, that question to, of course, you have to put a rating system across calcium, mag, and potash, but look at those 3 and how close they are to balance to each other on the base saturation. The scale can be used, so it's not just focused on calcium.
Understood. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that there's a proper way of asking that question, right? And experiment.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So good point to make. And James, that is a matter of record because we are being recorded here, so we will be held accountable. Should we proceed with that question, we'll be held accountable for doing it right, we hope. So, yeah, but good that you mentioned that. So I'd like to thank the resource people for sharing their insights and their comments and their questions. And I'd like to thank others on the line who chose to remain silent but made this call worthwhile. It's been a pleasure to participate in all these conversations and the discussion since October. And a reminder that a recording of this particular conversation will be available, and of course the other ones too. So the conversation is available to you. Going back to October is available to you at our webpage or directly from any of the OSU people who are on the call. So without delaying you any further, wishing you health and good days coming forward and good luck in your work, and we hope to hear from you soon. And at this point, we'll end the call. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.